Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, which is part of Pearson's Memorable Teaching Moments author webinar series. Today, I'm very excited to be facilitating this conversation with our author, Jane Martin. Now, for those who don't know me, I am Abhijit Sengupta, and I'm Senior Sponsoring Editor at Pearson. I commission textbooks and resources for marketing, as well as management, OB, and HRM related subjects for the UK higher education market. Today's session is called Teaching Marketing, Rising to the Challenges of the Changing Classroom. Now, this webinar will try to offer insights into the author's extensive teaching experience over the years and discuss how student cohorts are changing significantly. Now, before we begin and I introduce our speaker for today, a little bit of housekeeping just to keep things in mind. We know that many of you are joining this webinar from your home or maybe public spaces, so we sometimes get some background noise. Therefore, we have put everyone on mute to ensure everyone gets the opportunity to hear our presenter. But the chat box will be open throughout the session, so you're welcome to say hello and just put in your message you may have for the speaker. If you would like to speak, please use your raise hand button on the bottom of your screen, and we will make sure that you can come off mute and ask your question. We would also like to thank all of those who have pre-submitted questions. We have tried to incorporate some of these questions, as many as we could possibly do, into the agenda to make sure that all your questions are answered. However, we would as always, we would like to keep this as an interactive and engaging session as much as possible. So please feel free to ask any questions you may have in the chat box, and we will try to answer them either on the go, or you can come off mute at the end of the session during the question and answer round after the presentation. If you are interested in getting a sample copy or demo of the author's work, we will be in touch with you soon after the webinar on how you can do that. And finally, this recording, along with a summary of today's session, will be shared with everyone in about a week time. So I'm guessing around 19th of March, approximately. Sorry. Let me now introduce our speaker for today, author of our popular title, Essentials of Marketing, Jane Martin. Jane is a senior lecturer in marketing and a program leader in marketing management at the University of Chester, UK. She has been lecturing in marketing for over 25 years and has previously taught at multiple universities in the UK and abroad. Jane has also been a member of the Chartered Institute of Marketing throughout her marketing career. Jane, we are very excited you could join us today and speak on this pertinent topic. I think it offers a huge scope of learning for all of us, myself included, to explore more about how teaching in the classroom has adapted to meet the changing needs, and how the book that you have written might be able to help with this, highlighting some of the key changes in the new edition that we published last year. All right, that's all from me now. So without any further ado, I will pass things over to Jane.
Okay, thank you, Abhijit. Thank you and welcome everybody. It's lovely to sort of virtually see so many of you joining us today. So I've been asked to sort of have a chat with you about what the textbook can help you with, and what we thought it'd be useful to do is perhaps, as Avijit says, give you some of my experiences. So I hope I don't come across as patronising, because I'm sure there's lots of you who've got lots of teaching experience within the room. But again, it's quite interesting to share some good practice, and hopefully that's what I'm going to do in the next sort of 40 minutes or so. So I am a senior lecturer in marketing. As Avijit says, I work at Chester Business School at the University of Chester, and we've seen a lot of changes over time. But what I thought I'd start with is a little bit about me. Avijit's stolen my thunder here now and told you lots of this already, but I have been a marketing lecturer for quite a number of years. It was a little bit frightening when I put that number on the screen, in fact, but 27 years. I've taught on undergraduate and postgraduate, and I've covered a range of subjects over time, from the very basics, the marketing principles or essentials, through to consumer behaviour, international marketing, marketing strategy, just to name but a few. I also am very heavily involved in quality assurance within our university, and I have been to visit other universities as well, where we look at the sort of the quality and standards in those different institutions. So that's been quite an interesting area as well. I externally examine for UK and European institutions, and I've been involved in a lot of student retention and attainment projects, which is where perhaps some of this experience comes from, because we've been having a look at how we can enhance that experience for students while they're with us. Taught a little bit in China as well, so as part of an undergraduate program that we had a partnership with, which was really exciting, very interesting, and a real eye-opener to see some very different ways of teaching and learning. And my original background was in business to business marketing. So that's just a little bit about me. I won't say too much more because I'm sure that's not what you're interested in today. So what I thought I'd start with was having a little look at the textbook. So I will give you a nod to Jim as well. Jim has been involved in the textbook. So Jim isn't with us today, obviously. But when we sort of revamped the book, we sort of decided really that we wanted to keep this simple. It's the essentials of marketing. And we're finding now, which I'll mention later, that over time, students really now are sort of changing in the way that they are taking in information. They can't take in, or don't want to take in, lots and lots of reams of information. So sort of the traditional text and some of the journal articles, they do find challenging. So tried to keep it very simple with some short sections, short bullet points that really sort of help and engage and give the students the real basics that they need. But within there, what we've also tried to do is encourage students to sort of think a little bit. So again, to break up those sections so it's much more manageable and usable for the students, we've got boxes in there with different topic areas for them to think about. So, for example, critical thinking, we find at Chester, and I'm sure at most other institutions, critical thinking is quite difficult for students to get to grips with, particularly in their first year of study. So what we've tried to do is just put some little boxes, some little vignettes, some ideas in there, just to perhaps get students to think while they're reading the book. So it goes beyond the traditional theory and concepts. And, it's quite useful. It might be a useful tool in the classroom as well, to just have some of those little snippets that you can perhaps break up some of those sessions to really get the students to think and get some good discussion. Obviously, with it being marketing, it's a very contemporary issue, a contemporary subject. So we've tried to include, some current issues in there, as well as some of those traditional concepts. So, for example, the case studies, we tried to look at some sort of quite new brands, some young brands, some very varied brands. I actually had a chat with a lot of my first year students before I did the case studies, and asked them what brands they're interested in. So we were looking at that audience straight away. I did my market research and checked out who my target audience was. So we had a look at a range of different case studies in a range of different industries. And there is one in there as well that does target an older audience. So you may have, if anyone has read the book, there's one on Saga, which in the UK is a brand that focuses on the over 50s market. Now, the reason that we included that was because we felt that students do need to think about different target markets. There's a tendency with my 18 and 19-year-old students to think that everybody over 50 has given up and they're all very old. So, so we try to incorporate some of that to get students to think a little bit more broadly as well about who their target markets might be. So yeah, we tried to keep some, interesting, some quite current, some different case studies in there that kind of move away from the traditional very big organizations. Obviously there are one or two in there, but we tried something a little bit different and tried to look at some smaller institutions as well. So within those case studies, you'll also perhaps notice that they're perhaps a bit shorter. Traditionally, case studies could be sort of 2 or 3 pages long, but again, it was about attention span, grabbing students' attention, and making sure that they sort of did grasp the key concepts. So the case studies we kept relatively short, usually no more than a kind of a page, with some really straightforward practical questions to get them really thinking about some of those different industries and some of those different marketing contexts. And within that, there's also the opportunity for them to apply those theory and concepts that they've been looking at within those chapters and within the classroom sessions. Another one that we put in there, you might notice towards the end of each chapter is a section called ethical thinking. And clearly ethics is a key issue now in marketing. It's something that we all need to be very aware of around sustainability and whether we're being good marketers in the field. So we've incorporated some ethical thinking areas, again, for conversation and for discussion, to get students to really think about those issues as they move forward, perhaps into a marketing or business career. As with all texts, we've got some chapter questions, or most texts, and one of those is understanding the basics. So again, this is very much about, focusing on those key concepts. But what we wanted to do was to take that a little bit further. So beyond those basics, which are questions you could potentially use in the classroom, we wanted to have a look at some deeper thinking and really get that critical insight. So especially for students who are perhaps at level 5, 6, or even 7, it's to perhaps really get them to think in more detail about some of those issues and challenges in marketing. So it's very much about that critical thinking again. And the action learning section we put in there really to help tutors. I know when I was sort of quite new to it, it's quite difficult at times to try and come up with something a little bit different, some activities that might be relevant for the students. And I just felt that it was a really useful section to put in there. So there are some activities that you can do that are perhaps based online, again, that can get student discussion, that can get some group projects on the go. So that's what the action learning was very much about. And beyond the reference list, there's some further reading in there too. So again, if you want your students to take it to the next level, there's some journal articles in there that you might find helpful or useful that relate to some of the topics that are within the text. Just while we talk about the book, I will get on to sort of meatier subjects around teaching and learning in a moment. But again, something else that we've got in there is the supplementary materials. And again, as when I was a new tutor, I found things like this invaluable. And even as an older tutor who's been in the job for a while, it's really helpful to have some different perspectives to refresh. So I thought this would be really useful to add a few extra bits and pieces in here that might be helpful. So in that instructor's manual, there's some class exercises that you might want to use with a group of students. There's some essay titles for each section, and some practical projects, because my students love a practical project that we can get them thinking, discussing, working in groups, particularly in a seminar setting. So there's different projects that relate to each chapter there. We've put some case study answers in there as well, and some answers to the different questions, to the understanding the basics and the deeper thinking sections, and some pointers for those action learning tasks. And there's also some self-assessment questions, so sort of like short answer and multi-choice. Again, I just think these are invaluable, as I say, particularly for new tutors. It's a great way to get some different insights. So if you are interested in taking a look at the book, then I strongly recommend you see if you can get the supplementary materials as well. They might be useful for you. So hopefully they will help. And I will mention some of these again as we go along, because it sort of incorporates with some of my teaching practice. So I'm presuming at this point, Avijit, I'm okay to go on if there's no questions about the textbook. I'll just take a pause. Are we okay?
Yes, we actually have one question which I believe you kind of covered. So Catherine has asked, some of her students do not consider last year's cases as being that current because they want to study ongoing campaigns that they see online. So her question is, have you integrated updates of these cases as they go on happening? Or how do you basically deal with this student expectation?
Well, the reason that, again, that I've selected some of those case studies are they're quite interesting. Some of them are quite interesting areas. And, it's difficult when you write a text to try and make sure that you can keep that ongoing. However, I'm hoping, or what I tend to do with the case studies that I use in other texts as well as my own, is that I use those as a foundation. So they're a really nice starting point for the students. And then what I tend to do is get them to find out what's going on. I think sometimes that investigation is a really great way to get students engaged and get them to understand how marketing is evolving, because it just doesn't stand still. It's changing on a daily or weekly basis. So that tends to be how I use the case studies. I'll use them as a foundation, and then I will get the students themselves to build on that within those sessions. And again, this is why we put some of those action learning activities in, because they can be ongoing. They are things that students can investigate for themselves. So I hope that answers the question. Case studies are difficult, because they do change. Everything changes so quickly. But yeah, that's how I would approach the use of those cases. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it sure does.
Okay.
We don't have anything as of now.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So that's good. This is what I tend to do in my classes. I will take a pause for questions to try and break it up a little bit rather than talk at people for too long. So that's fabulous. Thank you. Keep them coming. Anyway, so what I thought I'd sort of talk about next is just some thoughts on student engagement. So I know that there were some questions around this that were sent through as well. Sorry. No, sorry, I've sort of jumped ahead. I do apologise. Sorry, I was talking about the changing student cohort. So before I move into that section, there are some challenges that we're all facing, and I'm sure that you will recognise a lot of these things that are on this screen at the moment. So we do find that, students aren't engaging as well for a range of different reasons. And, that's perhaps because of some of the external factors on the right-hand side of that slide, that there are more students having to work, for example, to maintain their sort of funds and make sure they can live while they're at university. And issues around, mental health seem to be a particular concern at the moment. So we do find that there is reduced engagement sometimes in class with a shorter attention span. And also, I think there was a couple of questions around this as well that I saw before the webinar that talks about this reluctance to interact. I do think there's perhaps a hangover from the COVID pandemic, where students were perhaps a little bit more isolated and perhaps not as confident to join in and share their views with their colleagues and peers. So I will touch on some of these and address some of these as we go along. But, linked to all of these things, we do find, and I'm sure a lot of you are finding, that perhaps attendance isn't as strong as it perhaps once was, largely because there are changes in priorities, because people are having to work, that they have got caring responsibilities and things like that. Other challenges, which again, hopefully I might be able to touch on today, is this lack of pre and post class preparation. We do find that students don't read as much anymore, that they're not preparing as well as they used to. So again, it's thinking about how we can overcome those challenges. And I will touch on that because that's a significant challenge that we face at Chester as well. And there does tend to be very much that focus on getting through assessments now rather than learning. So I think that's some challenges that a lot of you that are listening today will probably recognize. And again, there is this need where, we are sort of time poor now as lecturers, I think, because we are having to deal with a lot of these external factors as well. There's much more support needed inside and outside of the classroom. A massive growth in international students who have very different needs and wants from home students. So it's very much a case of thinking about how we deal with that, how we support and help those students through their studies. And there is a big reliance on artificial intelligence now as well, which I will also touch on. So again, I don't think those observations will be a surprise to any of you, and I'm sure you can probably add to that list yourselves. But how can we actually deal with that? Well, I've tried to come up with a few things that we sort of do at Chester, and myself in particular. And again, these are probably lots of things that you guys already do or now, but I just thought I'd share them and put them all into sort of one area. These are some ideas. So the first thing that I have found, I do some very big lectures with very large numbers in, but I also do some sessions that have much smaller numbers, which are easier to get that engagement. But one thing I'm finding with the very big lectures is that engagement is quite difficult. It's becoming more challenging, and students do have shorter attention spans. So what I do try to do is break it up into short, sharp sections. So whereas I might have used to have talked about lots of overheads and lots of kind of models and theories, I tend to kind of just focus on one point and just cut it right down and not give them all the detail. So the way that I do that is sometimes, for example, in large lectures, you can see on the overhead here, it's kind of don't be afraid to let them do the thinking. I think sometimes when you've got these very big classes, there's this kind of feel that you've got to keep control and you've got to keep talking. So one of the things I do is I've let go of that, and I do some short, sharp sections, and I don't try to cover everything. I give those key points out to the students and get them to have a think about them. So in a large lecture, I will just stop and pose questions and actually get them to talk about them. Now, in a big lecture, that's challenging because there's a lot of noise, there's lots of students talking, but it really refreshes them. It gets them to start to discuss. They're quite surprised sometimes that I'm just letting go and saying, talk about it. They don't always want to share because, they don't like to talk in big sessions. But what we do also use at Chester a lot is you can see a few bullet points down on that slide, some response tools. So we use something called Padlet. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with Padlet, where students can just put some online ideas in there, but we've also used something called Vivox or Kahoot or similar. So it's very easy to set up, and you can just get some very short, sharp answers off the students, and you can build sort of word clouds on the board, or you can get some bullet points, which is a fantastic way to try and engage with those large groups. We do find that students like to interact. They always have their phones or their iPads with them anyway. So it's a really nice way to sort of actually engage them, and they can see what's going on around them in the classroom without having to pinpoint particular students and ask them a question, because they really don't like to do that. So it's giving them that freedom, I think. You have to have a loud voice to bring them back to you when you shout across that very large room. But, I find this works really well. It refreshes them. And in amongst that, with those large lectures and short lectures, the large lectures or the small ones, we, tend to put in some very short activities that do relate to the topic. So, for example, I will use something like the ethical thinking or the critical thinking boxes from the text, and just pose that question to just let them think about it for a few minutes and talk to the people around them. So it works really well. Or show them a model and get them to think about how that model works rather than me try to explain it. And again, I find that kind of gets some good engagement, and then we can sort of talk about it together as a group once they've got their thoughts together. So I think it's letting go a little bit in the large lectures. And if all else fails, I also find that just if they sort of go quiet or they're starting to look bored or drifting off, I'll even get them to stand up or sit down with in response to a question. So I'll ask them something about, what they think about a brand, get them all to stand up. And then if they don't agree, some people will sit down. So it's just that movement. If you have a big, a big enough room, I sometimes even get them around the room talking to each other. I tell them to go and find someone, and one has to come up with an advantage of a particular model and one has to come up with a disadvantage, and they have to come together. And again, it's a great way to get that student interaction and engagement. I know that's not always possible within very large lecture rooms, but even just getting them to talk to the people in front or behind rather than the people sat next to them, they're usually the ones that they know. So get them to talk to somebody behind who they perhaps don't know. Again, a really nice way to get some classroom engagement. So very simple, very sort of simple techniques. And I'm sure, again, lots of you have used those, but we just find that that's a great way to get some of that engagement with those larger groups. Couple of other thoughts about student engagement in class. And again, this works for the large or the small groups. But I've mentioned using things like the think critically boxes or the think ethically boxes from the textbooks. But again, the students love a short YouTube clip. And, if you get them to sort of, I sometimes put the marketing principle type stuff. I'll put something on about pricing from a YouTube clip, because they sometimes listen to it more than they listen to me. So it's a great way. It's 2 or 3 minutes where they don't have to listen to my voice, and they can get some really useful information from that particular YouTube clip. Again, mini cases, mini questions that just get them to apply some of those concepts. And again, they can be very short and sharp, but it's a great way to refresh, especially if you've been talking to them for a little while. And I am aware that I'm talking at you for a while, so I will stop shortly to see if there's any more questions. The other thing that we do as well is very much, I know we sort of do tend to teach to assessments now, because students kind of want that. They're more worried about their grade than they perhaps are about the learning process in some cases. But incorporating that assessment into the class sessions is a great way to get students focused as well. So in my first year class, for example, their first assignment is looking at segmentation and building a persona. So we actually get them in class to sort of design their personas, talk to their peers, get their peers to critique it. And I've literally just an email pinged in just before this webinar with one of my students saying, can I use my persona that I created in my class? And I said, yes, please do, because that's what we want you to do. So it's a really useful way. The students really get to grips with it and they help, and that peer support gives them a bit more confidence in what they're doing. And the other thing, I suppose, and again, this is what we tried to do a little bit with some of the cases in the textbook, is to use a range of examples that go beyond those large multinationals. There is a tendency for us, and I've done that myself, to go for the big, the Apple case studies, the Coca-Cola case studies, the very big, well-known brands. And there is definitely a place for that. There's a reason why they are as big as they are, and it's important to look at them. But we also find, that we will use like public sector examples. So we'll get people to look at, very smaller cases around perhaps local NHS issues or local council or government issues that they can be impacted by. Small businesses in our locality we use a lot. We really use those students' experiences. And one thing I'll mention shortly is sort of the use of field trips as well. But we work very closely. We're very lucky to have the very beautiful Chester Cathedral near where I work. So we do use that as a case study as well, because they have a very small budget, but they need a lot of marketing. So things like that, those interesting cases, something that students perhaps wouldn't think of, that are a little bit outside the box, again, are a great way to get some of that in-class engagement. I'm going to take a pause there, Abhijit, to make sure that everyone in the room's refreshed. So are there any questions up to this point? I have got a few more things to say on the next page, but anything so far?
No, we don't have any
Okay.
questions in the chat. And we do have some pre-submitted questions, but I think we can park them for the question and answer session at the end.
That's great. Thank you. I just thought I'd take that pause.
Absolutely. Refreshes you.
Practice what I preach. Anyway, anyway, so yeah, a few other thoughts on engagement, and this is another plug for another arm of the Pearson brand. We use a simulation game as well, which has been fantastic. We've been using it for a number of years now, and it's called My Marketing Experience. So there's a little picture of it up there, and it's just a brilliant tool that the students use. So what we do with that is the students are doing their marketing essentials, but alongside of that, they're applying all of that knowledge into this into the simulation game. And again, it's fantastic because they're trying out these marketing principles without damaging a very big brand. They can do it in the safety of a simulation. There's also the fact that they're doing that group work, they get competitive, and it gives them a chance to really understand some of the data that sits behind the marketing decisions as well. So marketing simulations, if you can use those, are a fantastic way to get the students involved. We have, obviously there is a cost involved in these, so we've had some of our colleagues as well kind of come up with their own game as well. So it is possible. You don't have to spend vast amounts of money creating those simulations, but we can build those simulations and throw curveballs in along the way to get the students to really think about the challenges that happen in that real world. We use lots of guest speakers, which is fantastic. I'll pick up on the guest speakers because we do use these as part of our assessment and avoiding artificial intelligence in assessment, actually. So if you don't mind, I'll talk about those a little bit later. But again, it is using those live cases and scenarios, the field trips. As I say, we are very close to the cathedral, and we take the students over there. They have a look around, they look at events and activities that they could create for the cathedral to really help with their brand image, their marketing and their customer retention. They want people to keep going back. We find that, just the basics, sometimes, we try to do all sorts of all singing, all dancing things in the classroom and introduce lots of technology and do all sorts of weird and wonderful things because we think that's what the students want. But recently it was really interesting. I just did a sort of a very basic classroom exercise with flip charts and paper, and we just built the session around this flip chart. So we sort of came up with a concept, then we did I did a bit of delivery, and then we thought about how we'd apply it. So they built it onto this flip chart, and then we talk about something else and they'd add it onto the flip chart. And it was really interesting because they all walked away and said, oh, that was a really great session, which I was very surprised about. But they had this visual that they could take away that had all these points and ideas on. It was a bit of a mind map, I guess. And, it's something I used to use many years ago, and I've tried to sort of move away and use all the technologies, but the students love a pen and a piece of paper. So if you give them some coloured pens and pencils, they're off and they really love it. So we do these kind of things. We have a workbook sometimes that we use that they can fill in. So it's again asking questions, getting them to fill in gaps, and using some of those that information they've gathered in a session on a poster presentation just at the end of the session. And again, I'm sure you all use the flip charts and what have you, but it's just interesting that, some of those old-fashioned ways of doing things sort of really seem to resonate with the students. So I'm kind of going back to my old days when I sort of first started in the business and having a think about what we did then and how that worked. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, sorry for interrupting you.
No,
So
that's
I
fine.
know this. We can go on and on about the student engagement bit, but so there is one question actually from Catherine, who would want to know a bit more about using live cases or scenarios that you just mentioned. So if you could just maybe elaborate a little on that.
Yeah. So we do sort of try and engage a lot with our local businesses in the local area. And we're often approached by them because they want some student help and support. So we will use those live cases as part of both in-class teaching and assessment. So my example with the cathedral, it's been fantastic for student engagement because they realise it's a real life issue, and it doesn't have to be a big brand that everybody knows. Sometimes those little brands, those little businesses, those little organisations really kind of resonate with those students. It's something they know, it's something they walk past every day, perhaps. We've even worked with just sort of a little greengrocers that's down the road. We've worked with some small digital companies, and we do find that those live cases, those live situations are just brilliant for the students. And it's also great if you can build that relationship with the local community, because we're doing something for the community as well, which is a really nice issue. The other thing is as well, it doesn't have to be that live. So one of my assessments that I'm doing with my first years at the moment, I've selected some quite new brands in the marketplace. So I did a little trawl before I wrote the assessments, and I found companies that people hadn't really heard of. One of them's a very small kind of artisan shop company that makes sauces, handmade sauces, and it was getting the students to have a little think about how they would develop that as well. So it's really nice to find those little companies that are hidden away, or if you've been into a store and you've seen something new that's come out, it's really nice because then the students will often follow that through. So we've found that students who've looked at one of these mini cases in their first year, they actually revisit it and remember it in their final year, and they will talk about it. And some of them even do their projects on it because they've kind of followed that company, because it's kind of resonated with them. And similarly, the same with the scenarios. It might be that we found a little scenario, that it might be a local corner store that's struggling to get customers in, and those little scenarios are a really good way to get students engaged. I think we find with graduates, when they come into the marketing industry or to come to university to study marketing, they all originally think they were going to be sort of brand managers for Coca-Cola or Kellogg's, or these very big companies, and actually lots of them end up in these very small organizations, but they have fantastic careers because they learn so much and work with those businesses. So I hope that answers Catherine's question. I think that probably covers what I was going to say. I'm happy to talk more about it if Catherine has anything else to ask, but
Yeah, it does actually. Thank you.
great. So just
We actually
yeah.
have, sorry, we have
Yeah.
actually
Mhm.
another question,
Yeah.
again on student engagement, and I think it's quite a pertinent one. So
Mhm.
believe it's a bit of a dilemma for teachers like you. So Lana is asking if you have any best practices you can suggest on the use of digital devices like laptops or mobile phones in the class. Because what we often notice is students are using social media or maybe doing some other courses while being in a class. But then at the same time, you cannot really restrict them from using their mobile phones because they are also needed at times for certain class activities. So yeah,
Okay.
any balance that you can strike
Yeah,
between.
it is a challenge. It is very, very much a challenge, because we do realize, I mean, my technique again is very, very old fashioned. I walk up and down an awful lot. And if the students think I'm nearby, they usually tend to hide the phone away. Um, I think it's an acceptance. I think it's sort of, again, not being afraid of them having those mobile devices and letting go a little bit. I do sometimes, I will ask students to say, if I'm sort of in the middle of a conversation, I'm talking about a concept, and I kind of know you can gauge the room, and I will ask them to put them down at that point, and I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that. Um, because we do want them, in some ways, we do want them to have those devices, because it is a great tool when we start to use, things like the Padlet, or we start to get them to use the technology to do a bit of research. So I think it's just having the confidence to say, okay, right, can we pop the phones down now, please? We're going to use them again in a minute for an activity, but at the moment, if you could just pay attention. And I think what I do find is that I know that's not a perfect answer, but what I do find is that if you are doing some of these other little activities and things in between, rather than just talking at students, they sometimes don't have the time to pick the phones up, so if you are doing that short, sharp, just say 5 minutes on a slide, and then, right, what do we think, and talk. And I think we've just got to probably accept the fact that there will always be some students that won't engage, and I suppose you have to be pragmatic and say, well, maybe it's their loss that they're not joining in. But if you're engaging the other people around them, they tend to want to join in anyway, and they'll ignore the others who are perhaps being a little bit more disruptive by using their phones and laptops. So I don't know if that's a perfect answer. But you know, that's I call them out really. I just ask them to put the phones down, and that's kind of their choice, whether they do or they don't. Is that okay?
Right. Yes, I think yeah, we can continue. We do
Okay,
have a couple of other questions, but we will keep them for perhaps the end of the
that's
session.
fine. Okay. Yes, so I suppose the thoughts on student engagement, just to finish those, you know, I did have questions about how do we get students to prepare. And I think we have to, as I said before, be prepared for no preparation, because lots of students won't. So this is why I do try to incorporate lots of those activities beforehand. I do have students who do, and I will continue to give work for them to sort of do before and after the sessions. I will never stop that, because there are many students who are very hungry to learn and they want that. But if there is any preparation that we want them to do, we tend to, again, try and limit it to something like a short case. So again, that's why part of the reason for the case studies in the textbook, that's why we kept them very short, because, you know, even on the bus on the way to university, they can have a quick scan through that. It's not a long thing for them to read. And I'd rather have some engagement rather than no engagement at all. I think, again, that's pragmatic stage that I'm probably at now with lecturing to students. But it is perhaps giving them some live activities as well, rather than necessarily expecting them to read chapters and chapters of books, or, you know, lots of journal articles. It is things like, you know, I want you to go away and get a newspaper article, which they also struggle with, because students don't tend to read newspapers at these days. But, you know, I want you to get a newspaper article and bring that to class and think about the marketing implications. So it's trying to find something that's a bit shorter, a little bit more engaging for them. And again, it is a challenge, and there will always be students who won't do it. But then again, there was students in my day when I was a student who didn't do it as well. So I think that, yeah, I think we've got to be pragmatic and you know, give them, again, short, sharp bites of things rather than too much preparation. Okay. The other thing I just wanted to touch on, because I know it's always something that comes up, and we are an institution where I'm struggling a little bit with this at the moment, because it's all very new. But it's this use of AI, and what we've sort of looked at it in two ways. We've tried to see it as a positive force in the classroom, and we've seen it as a challenge when we get to assessment. So I'll mention assessment in a moment, if I may, but we're trying to use AI as a positive force in the classroom, because we know that companies are going to use it. These students now are going to use AI as part of their job role. So what we're trying to do is not fear it, because we did all fear it at first. We didn't even want to use the word AI and let students know that we knew what that was. So we're trying to use it in a more positive way. So what we'll do is, you know, we will bring up ChatGPT or others and get students to sort of critique the benefits and look at the challenges of using artificial intelligence in the organisation. And what we've been finding is that, you know, the students themselves will see the problems. They will see the issues with AI, and that it's not perfect yet. It may be in the future, but currently it's not perfect. And, you know, we found that, you know, in some ways it has discouraged students from using AI in their assessments as well, because they can see the problems and issues that AI has at the moment. So I thought I'd just give an example of one of the exercises that we do. So I mentioned earlier that my first year assignment, they look at segmentation and then create a persona. So there is a temptation for them to go onto an AI tool and create a persona that way. So what we did was we've had seminar classes, and we have got them in a room and said, okay, create one, get an AI persona, have a look. And what we do is get them to critique it, because again, you know, often because at the moment AI, and because of the way that it's working, it hasn't got all of that knowledge and background necessarily about the brands that we're discussing. it can struggle and it can throw up some very interesting elements of a customer persona. So what we do is get the students to tell us what the problem is, and it's to get them to think, well, okay, if we are going to use this in the workplace when we graduate, what's good about it? What are the positives? But actually, we can't just say, oh, look, there's a persona. There you go. They need to think about how they support that, how they justify it, how they how they can get some evidence, because as a manager, I'm not going to just take it as read that that persona is the right one. I want to know the details behind it. So that's one of the exercises that we do. We get the students to critique the persona, tell us what the problems are, and if they are going to use some of the AI, how do you back that up, and how do you ensure that that's a really robust target market for your marketplace? So that's how we use it in the classroom. But how to avoid it in assessment is a whole other challenge for us. And I'm sure you're all grappling with some of this. And we have seen examples of AI. Again, fortunately, at the moment, AI isn't brilliant. So we are managing to detect a lot of it. But we've been doing a lot of teamwork around this with our business team and the marketing team. So we've been trying to move away from those generic questions, really, those traditional essay questions, and we're trying to make everything much more practical. So, and it works because that's what the industry wants as well. Employers want students who can do these practical activities. So we do use something like the simulation. We found that's been really helpful, that my marketing experience, because the students are working on it as they go along. We assess them by reflecting on what worked well and what didn't within that process. And because as tutors, we see the process that they've gone through within the game, we know, what the outcomes are, and we know that they can't possibly use AI to get the right answers. And there's also tools within the simulation that you can complete and fill in, so we can assess through that as well. Again, I mentioned guest speakers earlier, and we use them a lot. We've got some fantastic people who love to come in and talk to our students, so we're very fortunate. But again, we might focus an assessment around a guest speaker. So it might be a topic or a theme that they've discussed, and we get the students to reflect on those viewpoints and do some of their own research as well. So that's a couple of methods. Again, those live cases are fantastic because, often if we are using, just a small organization down the road, there's very little AI knowledge about it. So that's really helpful if you're using those as a case within your assignment. So those small companies rather than the big ones are really fantastic because, it will be pretty easy to get an AI assignment around Coca-Cola or Apple or one of the other major organizations. Again, I've mentioned the field trips, but projects related to sort of marketing challenges at the venue, that kind of thing is absolutely fantastic. So we've done that with the cathedral, and practical activities. So one of the things we've been doing is doing some pitches. So the students are getting practical hands-on experience of how to pitch and how to present a pitch to an organization. And what they're doing is they're creating their own pitch packs with evidence in there to show why they think this marketing method is the best. They're putting in examples of their campaign, and it's very much related to those field trips. So this one in particular, the first years have done this cathedral project and created a pitch, and the cathedral have sort of had a look at them and taken them on board as well, which is fantastic. So it's that sort of win-win. But we do lots of things because obviously we have digital marketing on our programs. And it's about, perhaps creating some content for a company, some unique content. They've been producing blogs, they've been doing online activities, doing webinars, in fact. So all of those things are really great ways. Not only do they sort of help to avoid AI, we can't completely avoid it, but it helps to avoid it. But it also challenges the students and gives them some of those really good practical skills they'll need in the industry when they graduate. Okay, I'm going to take a pause again, Abhijit, just before I finish on my last theme.
Questions? Any further questions in the chat so far?
There aren't, sorry.
No.
There
aren't any.
Okay,
no.
that's fantastic. So I'll finish up and finish off on the last couple of slides.
That sounds good.
Okay. So, okay, I'm aware of time as well, but I just wanted to touch on international students because again, I think there was a question about international students that was put forward. Um, and we find it a challenge to help and support students who perhaps are doing or are working where English isn't their first language. It's quite difficult. And one of the things that we just try to do is get to know our students. I think one of the questions that was asked around about, how do we envelop those different cultures? How do we avoid offending students from different cultures? Well, for us, what we try to do is to get you to know the students. Now, we have some very, very big classes of international students, particularly on our postgraduate, and that's difficult. However, even in the large classes, what we do try to do is make sure that we're really fully aware of the range of nationalities in there. We sort of make sure that we know if there are any sensitive situations happening in a particular student's country or culture, and then we can make those informed choices about content and suitability. But I think the thing to say in answer to the question that we had about that is, you can't be afraid really to tackle some of the sensitive issues because, if you make it clear from the start that we're going to cover a range of different things, students are often very happy to share some of their experiences, and I have got some examples of that, but I perhaps shouldn't share them on screen about some of the individuals that I've worked with. But that conversation and them sharing, because there's sometimes we find that the students are just as nervous about the situations and being in another country where they feel people might be a little hostile towards them, because generally they're not. Everyone just is really interested in what our other international students have got to say, so it's fantastic. One of the things we do, I've put on there a cultural sharing activity. So we have a session where we actually get the students into groups. We try and split them up so there's a range of cultures. And in the UK, I'm sure everyone's aware that we have our own subcultures. We have the Welsh, the Irish, and the Scottish, and that causes a lot of interesting discussion. So it's actually talking about those different cultural aspects, and it's a great way for students to get to know each other. It really helps the students to integrate, and it takes some of that nervousness away in case there are sensitive issues that might, and it's much easier to broach. So it's fantastic because we pull it all together, and we also then put it into an international marketing context and think about, what that might mean if this particular culture celebrates a particular festival, for example. What could that mean for an international marketer? So it's really great. It's a fantastic way for students to share, to get involved, to integrate, to lose that kind of barrier, and also to put it into a marketing context. So I'd say don't be afraid to ask them to share experiences, because students are often the first ones who want to tell us all about their wonderful cultures, and it's really interesting from a tutor's perspective as well to hear some of those different issues, scenarios, and what have you. And it is very much getting the students to think about their own knowledge and applying it to those marketing principles, because the marketing principles tend to stay the same no matter where you are. It's just a slightly different context, and we have to think about it in slightly different ways. So that would be my take on international students, and we've got a fantastic international cohort. So yeah, we really embrace it, and I think if you embrace it, the students embrace it, and they're okay to open up and talk about things. So I'm being guilty of what I tell people not to do and talk at people for far too long, but I'm just going to wrap up now, really, in conclusion. I mean, what we try to do is kind of listen to the students and what do they want. I observe, I do have some big classes, and I know sometimes they sit and get bored. So I watch them and I look at what makes them bored. And if they do look bored, that's when I'll stop them and go, right, have a minute, talk to each other, or stand up, or, move around the room. And I try to just reinvigorate them that way. But what's getting their attention? What is it that they really love? And also think about how you feel. I mean, I'm sure many of you in here have probably stood in a classroom and think, oh my goodness, I feel really fed up with this. I've used this information 100 times and I'm getting bored of it. So, if you're bored, they might be too, but don't assume that, because students take in information in very different ways. I often see students sitting looking miserable throughout the session, but as they walk out the room, go, I loved that. It was really interesting. So it's talking to the students, it's gauging the room, and if it's not working, don't be afraid to just tip everything up in the air and do something different. So that's what I tried to do, and I've got a few activities and tools up my sleeve, little chat areas, the thinking ethically boxes in the textbook. They're really handy. And it's sort of trying to tailor the sessions to each of those different groups, because our first years learn very differently to our second year students, our postgrads learn very differently to our third year students, and our international students again learn very differently. So it's trying to think about, what works for each of those. And a final tip is we do what we call midterm evaluations. And again, I'm sure a lot of your institutions do. And it's just stopping in the middle of the year, or at a point in the year, and just talking to students and saying, what is it you really like? What can we do more of? What is it you really don't like? And how can we change it? And I suppose that's what we call co-creation. So we try to co-create some of that content with the students and see what it is that they like as well. So thank you for listening. That's a whistle-stop tour of all my teaching tricks. And I hope that, some people have taken something away from that. I hope it's been useful. Yeah, so that's me. And yeah, have we got any questions?
Great. So that was quite an informative session, and I'm sure we all will go back home today a lot more enriched. And I think it's now time, as the slides say, time for questions. And you can put in your questions on the chat, or maybe raise your hand to come off mute. And Jane, we do have some pre-submitted questions, which I can begin with those, but I think before that, there is one question which came from Kerry. She's asking if you have any advice on teaching senior leaders in public bodies such as NHS. So I know this might have come up also in the pre-submitted questions. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when you're teaching, because again, it's a very different experience when you're teaching people in the business world already, because they again have very different wants and needs and different experiences. And I find that, again, it's asking them, it's what do they think? It's kind of, so obviously as tutors, we've got the knowledge about the marketing concepts and the marketing theories, and it's sort of getting those people to sort of think about how they apply it. So again, my tip for doing that really is sitting around a table and having a chat with people, because again, those people know far more about the NHS than I do, or far more about the government or whatever industry that they're in. So I think it's embracing again everything that other people do. We can't know everything, and we've got that marketing knowledge, and it's sitting and talking to those people and saying, what do you think really? It's sort of passing the baton back to those organizations. That said, we do have quite a strong NHS presence, for example, within the university. So we have a lot of nursing students, and we also do some hospital management type programs as well. So we do have some knowledge around there, and again, it does tend to be the principles tend to stay largely the same. It's just thinking about how you harness that in a slightly different environment. So open the discussions, I guess, is my advice. Again, I know that's probably not the tick box answer that people perhaps want, but that's how I've always approached it. I remember when I was very wet behind the ears and I didn't know an awful lot when I was very sort of new to teaching, and that was kind of the first lesson for me. It was like, well, ask people, because they know as much about one topic as I know about marketing, and over the years you build that knowledge. So yeah, I think just talk, just ask people what they think. Be confident to
Absolutely.
do it.
Absolutely. I think it kind of varies. I mean, everyone sees their own way of doing this. We actually have Catherine, who would like to ask a question. Before we let her come off mute, she has also asked a question in the chat. What is the minimum number of hours you would recommend to cover your textbook? And also, if we can have Catherine come off mute, I'm not sure if she has the same question she wants to ask or if it's something different.
Do you want me to answer that one first, or do you want me to
Uh,
wait for Catherine?
yes, perhaps then we can.
Okay. Well, again, I don't suppose there's no right or wrong in the manual. There is a little bit of an outline that sort of suggests how you might want to use the textbook within the classroom. We've found that, or I've found that with a textbook, it can be used within a very short, sharp course. So we have had sort of, 8 or 10 weeks, very intensive courses where you can dip in, because the nice thing about it, again, that's why I kind of like to keep it simple, because it gives you the basics and you can dip into it quite easily. If you want to extend that out, you could make it at least probably a good 12-week course, or you can double up the content and make it even longer. So the content that's in here, I tend to teach. We have at my institution at the moment what we call long thin modules. So ours last for it's essentially two semesters. So we'd have sort of 24 weeks of teaching, and we'll use those different cases and those activities. So it can be used in a very short, sharp way. It can be used in just a 12-week semester very easily, and you can pick out those chapters, or you eke it out a little bit and use it in those 24-week sessions, because there's so many different activities that you can get students involved. So if you need to really hit them with just the content, it's great for doing that, because you can just get that really short and sharp. But if you want to develop those ideas and use those different activities within a classroom setting, then that's great as well. And there's sort of activities, the activities in there are things that students can do in their own time as well. So if it is quite intense and short, there's some of those deeper thinking sessions or sections that they can go away and have a little think about. So I think it's quite adaptable, really, is my answer, I guess, to that.
Right. I hope that answers. So that was actually Catherine's
Oh, okay.
questions. And we can move on to some of the pre-submitted questions that we have. And so I would like to begin with this one, which asks how you can foster individual contribution in a group project. So any
It's
thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's difficult with groups because, again, I mentioned one of the challenges earlier on as being kind of some of the mental health issues that some of our students are facing. Students are often quite anxious to join in with groups. We're finding that more and more. However, again, there's different ways to do it. So I think if you can keep some of that short and sharp initially, and get them to move around the room and get to know each other. We do a game in our first week called People Bingo. And basically it's a bingo sheet where you have to go and find somebody who fulfills the criteria. So it could be, someone who can speak French, or someone who enjoys cooking or whatever. But it's a great way to start to break down barriers. So we find that that's a really nice way to just start to get people talking, and they find out a little bit about themselves. So the initial thing we do when we know we're going to be doing group work is to try and break down some of those barriers initially. I think, again, if it's sort of short, sharp activities that you've got within that group, that you can bring them together and perhaps separate them out, that can work quite nicely. There's always a challenge. We do have issues where perhaps some students don't participate. If it's part of an assessment, students get particularly upset. So we have had circumstances actually where the group members have sort of taken things into their own hands and said, we kind of need this person to either work with us, or we don't really want them in the group. So as tutors, we will intervene. And sometimes it might just simply be finding out what's going on with that student. Sometimes it could be that they've got anxiety. And once they know that they can work with that group better, it's finding out the challenges. Why is it they aren't working? So that sometimes helps as well. But I think as well, some very sort of prescriptive sort of activities that sort of get them engaged, giving them questions that they need, or giving each one a role, is a really nice way to do it. Because again, if one isn't pulling their weight with that role, then that can sometimes get the others on board to say, come on, what's going on? We're finding we have found challenges, but we do find that actually a lot of the students, because they start to get to know each other, because we are breaking down the barriers, that they get to support each other actually and pull each other through. So we don't have too many challenges where it's just students who just really can't be bothered. There are one or two. And in that case, what we'll try and do is perhaps find something more individual, because if they're not engaging, sometimes there's just not a lot you can do. But yeah, I think short, sharp things, breaking down some barriers, or if it's real, if you can see that there is a real issue, just talking to that student, finding out why. It could be simply something like that, or they just don't gel with that group and they might work well in another one. So again, not a perfect answer, but you know, that's some of the things that we tend to do with those groups.
Right, right. So on a related note, as we're talking about classrooms, so do you think, my next question would be, do you think a marketing classroom in its nature is somehow specific as compared to other subjects, perhaps?
Um, I think the challenges in the classroom are universal. I think everything that I've talked about today won't be a surprise to anybody. I think the beauty of marketing, and I'm probably biased, is that, you know, it's an interesting subject. It's really dynamic. You can approach it in so many different ways. You've got all the different live cases that we can use. We have got the technology. We can embrace AI, which I think some other subjects perhaps can't do quite so easily. So I think there's similarities in the sense that we will be facing those classroom challenges about lack of engagement or problems with group work. But I do think from a marketing perspective, it's a great subject, and I think it is something that, you know, we can do something really inventive and creative with. And I think the students are often quite creative on a marketing course as well. And, you know, if we can harness some of their experience, abilities and knowledge, and as I say, maybe even co-create, find out what they want to do within a classroom, then, you know, that can be a really nice way to move forward. So yeah, I think marketing students are obviously far, far better, much more creative. No, I think yeah, there are some differences, but there's a lot of similarities. Yeah.
Wow. And I know you have touched upon AI and its impact in teaching in today's classrooms. But so, do you, standing today, how do you see marketing teaching, changing in the next 5 years, perhaps, uh, in context to generative AI?
Um, Again, I think the beauty of marketing and the problem with marketing is that it doesn't stand still. We are very much driven by technology. So I don't think it's ever been a subject that, you know, that hasn't faced changes and challenges. So I think it's probably just the next evolution. It's the evolution of, I use the right word, the next evolution of marketing, really. You know, years ago when I first started, we talked about relationship marketing and we talked about direct marketing, and that's kind of got subsumed into the whole kind of general idea of marketing. And now we've got digital marketing, which is really marketing anyway. So I think, yeah, I think there's always going to be technological challenges, but again, I think marketing as it is, I think we'll face them and we'll find ways to embrace those. And I think we have to, because that's how the next generation are going to be working. They're going to be using those technologies to you know, view products and develop brands. I think it's going to be challenging. I think it's getting more and more difficult, and it's perhaps more and more difficult sometimes to stand out, I guess, because everybody's sort of jumping on that bandwagon of doing the same thing. But I think I see it as a positive. You know, I think, you know, it's especially for tutors, actually, it keeps you fresh. I think that's why I'm still doing the job 27 years on. I think if I was just sort of doing a sort of a standard job, I'd probably be a bit bored with it by now. But it keeps you on your toes, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's positive. Again, I'm not sure if that's answered. I've gone off on a tangent there, Avijit, but does that sound okay?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's, I believe, the beauty of marketing. And so I am conscious of time, and I know we have a lot of participants who might have other engagements. But maybe before just wrapping up, there's one question that I would really want to ask you, and because our theme of the webinar is memorable teaching moments, so
Mhm.
I had to kind of plug it somewhere. So, what do you think is the most memorable teaching moment of yours?
Oh, there's so many. I think one of my most memorable teaching moments was I was very, very young when I started. And it kind of set me up for the rest of my career. And I was sort of quite new to the role, and I had a guy who was very high up in an industry, and he asked me, "Who are you to be teaching me marketing?" And it was quite an eye opener because I thought, yeah, who is that person? And it was kind of that's when I realized I could kind of hold my own and do the job, really, because I thought, well, yeah, I've got the knowledge, I've got the marketing knowledge. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the NHS and the business leaders and things like that. It's having that confidence to say, okay, yeah, I don't know everything, but I know quite a lot about marketing generally. And that really stood me in good stead. And I think that's what gave me the confidence to sort of keep going. So that's probably one of them. And I think my other one is when I was teaching in China, it was just such an experience. I had a great time. The students were fabulous, and it was so lovely to see a different side of teaching. And then my most favourite moments generally every year are that sort of when the students get to that final end point and they're thanking you because they're kind of moving into their career and they're getting up on that stage on graduation day. So I think that's again why I keep doing the job. So yeah, I think they're my three. I've got three. Am I allowed three there, Abhijit?
Absolutely, absolutely. As many as you want.
Yeah, I could go on all day because I've got lots of them in
Yeah,
7 years, but those
true,
three
true.
that stand out.
Right. All right. I think we got really valuable thoughts to take home with us today, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining and participating in this webinar. Thank you for the questions and your feedback. And of course, a huge thanks and a round of applause for Jane Martin for joining and sharing your knowledge with us today. We really appreciate it. And we will be in touch with everyone who has joined the webinar after this session, and you will be receiving two emails from us. One will give you information on how you can get in touch with someone from Pearson for things like a sample copy of the books, a demonstration of various Pearson courseware like a Revel or MyLab, or maybe just a consultation if you would like to speak with someone from our company and know a bit more about what we do and what all resources we have to offer. And then there will be a second email a bit later, which will contain a link to the recording for today's session and a summary of the webinar. So thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you found this webinar useful as much as I did. And as the aim at Pearson for us is to add life to a lifetime of learning and thereby helping people achieve more in their lives. So I truly hope you had a great learning experience today. Have a lovely afternoon, evening, everyone. And thank you once again, Jane, for participating and sharing all of your knowledge with us. It's really indeed great pleasure speaking with you. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks.